Well, Advocate SiphoMantula of the ThaboMbeki African School of Public and International Affairs joins us now via video link for more. Advocate, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Evening, Sipho, and Jumbo Africa to your viewers.
Indeed, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Advocate, many of these liberation movements came to power on promises of land, justice, dignity for all. Now, decades later, they speak of a new phase of emancipation centered around economic transformation. Is this a tacit, I would say, admission that political liberation failed to deliver economic justice?
I may not say that they failed, but they had challenges and some shortcomings. And when you look at the importance of this summit, I think they have considered what happened in 2024, considering what happened in Mozambique, where there was an electoral violence. You will recall Sipho, Botswana, there was a change of government. South Africa, we saw GNU coming into action. But also what is important in Sipho, it is that the historic and the collective struggle of those liberation movements was not all about colonialism or apartheid, but it was also about what Nkrumah talked about, the last stage of neo-colonialism, which is imperialism. And that's where Sipho, you'll find that they have raised issues of unilateralism, unipolar attitudes, and the right-wing narrow political and economic nationalism and racism. And I think those are the key issues that came forward. But when they spoke about conflict and political instability in period, I think for me the missing point for them was that, yes, you might have focused on the Middle East, you might have focused on Sudan, but within the SADC region, was there memory loss on the DRC? Was there memory loss on Eswatini? And also the question of when you say there is interference in electoral processes and internal weaknesses, what about electoral justice? When are we strengthening judiciary so that when they adjudicate electoral disputes, there is no favoritism? And finally, Sipho, I think it was very important for them to can acknowledge that it is important for them within their movements to can combat corruption, patronism, the issue of family and friends and factions that are within liberation movements. I think for me, those were the key issues that came out, and the role of youth and women being not at the periphery, but at the center of the growth of the liberation movement. So it was a true reflection, but at the same time, Sipho, you will understand that they were pushed to have this summit because of the current geopolitics that are now happening with the global traffic of tariffs, with imminent sanctions against most of the African countries. So this is an important gathering of the liberation movements.
Now, Advocate Mantula, I think you make very valid points there, especially when you touched on neo-colonialism, because it is a subject that we pretty much still grappling with here in Africa, just looking at the presence of the West and the imprints that the Western countries have had on the African countries. But from your vantage point at the ThaboMbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, how would you assess the ideological consistency or the evolution of these movements since liberation? Have they perhaps abandoned their Pan-Africanist and socialist roots for neoliberal governments models?
Absolutely. But Sipho, for me, I was also taken aback by President Ramaphosa when he used a philosophy of Walter Rodney when he talks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And I think as the ThaboMbeki School, Sipho, the issue that came closer to us in this summit was the question of education, the issue of training of young leaders, the issue of also looking at an introspection of saying that as the continent, why are we still going to many summits called by the West and we don't develop our own mechanisms? And the issue of financial flows, Sipho, you will recall that the former President ThaboMbeki, as he was present there, he was instrumental in pushing that concept for them to understand that illicit financial overflows are also the part of these multinationals and also the role of the foreign donors, those who are funding the opposition or those who are creating many parties to can create havoc and take advantage. And that's where simply I will say, when you look at the proper assessment, the issue of political education, very important. The issue of ethics and statecraft, to understand that when you are in government, you serve the national interest of the citizens. It is not that you are serving the party interest. And I think that's where simply assessment in the institutions of higher learning, it has been always the unlearning and the relearning of the new philosophies, which are grounded in most of the founding fathers and founding mothers of the African liberation.
And not a single day passes without the media reporting on corruption scandals, in whatever form in the different parts of the African continent, and with the growing disillusionment among citizens. How do these parties sort of reconnect with the people when they are increasingly seen as part of the elite rather than champions of the masses? I mean, we've just heard President Ramaphosa acknowledging that people are running out of patience. But how then do you interpret that remark in the broader context of the declining electoral support that these liberation movements are facing?
Simply correct of what you are saying, but what these liberation movements are doing, it is to play hide and seek. They will create your ethics committee, integrity committee, disciplinary process, commissions of inquiry. And maybe we should grapple with this concept of when are we commissioning these commissions of inquiry? Because it seems that when there is an internal and external corruption that happens between the multinationals as well as the state and the party being involved in period, that it is a major regress and a fault for these liberation movements. They have said simply they want to move towards economic emancipation and liberation. But we still borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank. We are still also looking at going to Trump and asking for lessening of the tariffs and trying to say that there is no racism in this country, when actually racism comes from the West. And secondly, simply you will understand that this question of understanding the role of the law enforcement, that the law enforcement must not be politicized or militarized. And we know what happened in Zimbabwe, what has happened in Mozambique, what has happened in SWAPO. There have been factions that have been born even since their inception. And this has been because they've been trying to control the law enforcement. They've been trying to control judiciary. And that's where we need to draw that line simply and say they need to combat corruption and take steps, because it will definitely make the citizens lose confidence, and the citizens will definitely have a voter apathy. And that's where the issue of those external interferences that they were talking about, and how do we strengthen the electoral management bodies in the SADC region. It's something that they should look into, that we should strengthen them, but we should not interfere with their independence.
All right. Great chatting to you, Advocate Mantula. Thank you so much for joining us. And I suppose the big question still remains whether these liberation parties still have the capacity and the moral authority to lead a united regional project of economic integration. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your analysis with us.
Asante sana, Sipho.
Indeed. Thank you. Well, Advocate SiphoMantula is from the ThaboMbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, speaking to us about, liberation movements, new phase of emancipation centered on economic transformation. Now, in this age of global economic realignment, with BRICS expansion, with US-China competition, especially China's influence on the African continent and rising African agency, we watch with keen interest how Southern Africa's liberation movements position themselves and whether they're united on foreign policy directions.